The old man told me that these people I was watching couldn't afford the basic essentials that we had all come to take for granted. Families of 10 or 12 were living in one 3-bedroom house because they could no longer afford the rent or mortgages on more than one house, even when they clubbed together, meaning that whole extended families came to live under one roof. After they had spent money paying their rent and buying food, they had very little, if any, left. Most of the bills they had went unpaid to the extent that only 2 houses left in the neighbourhood still had electricity. Their phones had been cut off long ago, isolating them from the outside world. They were even unable to listen to the radio or to watch television, because without electricity, their stereos and television sets didn't work, though even those items were sold eventually just to provide more money so that they could continue to live. Things had then become so bad that they had to stop paying their council tax. Instead of trying to figure out why this had happened, the local council instead decided to cut off supplies. There was no refuse collection, meaning any garbage would just sit in gardens or in the streets, slowly decomposing unless they were thrown onto a fire to provide heat to either keep the residents warm or actually to cook food on, now that the gas was beginning to be turned off in most houses, yet another bill they couldn't afford to pay. The final and worst act, according to the old man, had occurred a week before, when, unable to pay their water rates, the water companies, in association with the council, had turned off their water supplies, meaning that no fresh water entered nor left the premises. Drinking water was no longer available, neither was water to bathe in. Toilets became useless as anything other than seats, because they would no longer flush, meaning urine and feces would not be carried away from the dwellings. The 2 houses still having electricity were the only 2 houses to still have water and gas as well, with people offering up money to the owners to help them with the bills so that they could continue to use their facilities, effectively turning the houses into public toilets and canteens. A lone motor vehicle could be heard pulling across the bridge. The old man turned to me and smiled, saying that was most likely some young, rich, single man, either a lawyer or an accountant, who had come across the river to find a whore for the evening. That was the only time a car ever crossed the bridge and came into those parts. The women in the neighbourhood were having to resort to selling themselves to men just so that they could have enough money to feed their children. It was degrading, devastating, and it threatened to tear families apart. But for some of them, it was their only option. I could feel the tears welling up in my eyes. Standing up and shaking the hand of the old man, I handed him an envelope I had been meaning to take to the bank. He looked at me strangely until I told him it was my gift to the neighbourhood, making him promise not to open it until I had gone. Breaking into a light sprint, I ran from the neighbourhood, heading back toward the bridge. On my way I saw a young woman, maybe even still a girl, she looked little older than 14, climbing into a large Mercedes of a businessman who was hiring her to fulfill his every desire. The car sped off just as I came to a stop. A chorus of screams and cheers echoed up into the sky. The old man must have opened the envelope containing £1,000, not really a lot in this day and age, but to those people it would seem like a fortune. My mind was reeling as I crossed back over the bridge. How could things get so bad without someone acting out to rectify it? How had the situation not been brought to my attention? Something like this should have been reported on my news broadcasts. Policies should have been put in place by the government to help out those in need. If the rich were still filthy rich, and the poor were just filthy, why had it been allowed to happen? With my clothes stinking, causing some people to cross the street just to avoid me, making me feel like some kind of monster, I headed back to my headquarters, where I now felt ashamed to have a shower in my office. As I came to the bottom of my building, I turned my attention to one of the television screens set up in the foyer, broadcasting one of my many television networks. There, stood proudly at the Houses of Parliament, were Queen Mary, my cousin, side by side with the smug Prime Minister who was addressing his public, blatantly lying about the state of the country. It made me feel sick. Something had to be done. The country was falling into ruin and our Queen and Prime Minister were doing nothing to stop it. I thought back to a story I had been told many years before, of how my great-grandmother had been robbed in her place as Queen by the birth of a bastard son who had leapt to the top of the line of succession. Then, as an extra slap in the face, they changed the laws on succession so that the oldest girl could become Queen, though of course that didn't come into effect until after my grandmother had died. Had things been different, I would now be king, and I would have the power to do something. That's when the idea hit me. I could have the power. I just needed to take my place on the throne in order to get it. My only real obstacle was that it was already occupied. Somehow, I had to dispose of the Queen.